The parking lot was empty. 2 suitcases. A cardboard box with 22 years inside. $87. Annie was 45. The company called it restructuring. What it meant was, she was gone. She sat in a 2008 Honda with a dying transmission, watching the sun fade. Somewhere, people came home to heat, to food they didn't count. Her ex had the house. She had the cold, the car, and a question. Where do you go when there's nowhere left to go? She didn't know yet. The answer was down, but Annie knew something most people don't. Survival isn't about having options. It's about seeing what's already there. She found the embankment 3 days later, driving the edge of state forest land. The hillside rose steep and sudden, maybe 15 feet tall, thick with oaks and birch. She pulled off and walked the bank, feeling the ground beneath her feet. Firm, not sandy, not waterlogged, just solid earth that had been holding itself for a long time. She spent the first week clearing brush. A shovel from the thrift store cost $8. She had time and almost nothing else. That was the advantage of having nowhere to be. The digging started easy, the top layer soft with leaves and decay, but underneath was clay, dense and cool to the touch. She learned quickly that you don't dig straight into a hill. You angle. You create a slope so water won't pool. Her hands blistered. The blisters broke open. She kept going anyway. By the 3rd week, she'd carved out a space maybe 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide, the mouth facing away from the wind. She framed it with scrap wood from an abandoned construction site, 2x4s rotting at the edges but solid in the middle. She salvaged a blue tarp from behind a fence. It wasn't waterproof anymore, but it was something between her and the sky. The first night inside, the cold came anyway. It seeped through the walls like the earth itself was bleeding winter into her bones. She wrapped herself in cardboard from dumpsters, layered it like insulation, found old blankets at a yard sale. Still, she shivered, her breath visible in the dark, her body curled tight on bare ground, listening to every sound the forest made at night. She thought about giving up. That's what people don't tell you about survival. Most of the time, it feels like failing in slow motion. Then came the storm. 3 days of rain that turned the forest into a marsh. She waited inside, listening to water pour off the tarp, certain the whole structure would collapse around her. But it didn't. And when the rain stopped, she ventured out and realized something that changed everything. The air inside the dugout was warmer than the air outside. Not by much, maybe 5 degrees, but it was there. She understood it then, not from a textbook, but from her own shaking body. The earth doesn't move like air does. It holds temperature. Soil is patient. It remembers heat from the summer and keeps it close. She started reinforcing the walls with more scrap wood, better angles, understanding the geometry of shelter by doing it wrong and then doing it right. She found a piece of old metal roofing and traded firewood to a neighbor she'd never spoken to for help nailing it down. The structure began to feel less like a hole and more like a choice. 4 weeks in, late September, she was expanding the living space, pushing deeper into the hill to create a second chamber for storage. Her shovel hit something that wasn't earth. The sound was wrong. Metal on concrete. She stopped, listened to that sound echoing in her bones. She cleared away the soil carefully then, using her hands more than the shovel. The dirt fell away and revealed a corner of concrete, then more, a curved edge. She brushed away decades of accumulation, leaves, soil, the slow burial of time, and found a metal hatch, maybe 3 feet across. Its surface rusted the color of dried blood. The realization moved through her like cold water. This was a fallout shelter. 1950s. Had to be. She'd heard stories about them. The government building bunkers for the end of the world, for families to huddle in while the sky burned. Most of them had been forgotten or torn down, but this one was here, beneath her feet, waiting. It took her 2 hours to pry the hatch open. The rust fought her, her hands bled, but the mechanism gave eventually, and the hatch swung down like a mouth opening, and she was looking into darkness so complete it seemed solid. She found a flashlight in her car, found batteries that still held a charge, climbed down metal rungs that were slick with age and something like mold, but alive, still holding weight, still built to survive. The bunker was small, maybe 12 feet by 20, the concrete walls unmarked except for water stains from decades past. But what stopped her was what filled it. Supplies. Rows of them, canned goods stacked in metal crates, the labels faded but the seals unbroken. Water containers, heavy and still full. Medical kits in sealed tins, blankets rolled tight. A hand-crank radio with its knob intact. A logbook on a small wooden shelf, its pages yellowed, the ink still readable. She opened the logbook with both hands steady. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1952. Shelter complete. All supplies catalogued. Time will tell if any of this matters. The handwriting was careful, the words of someone who'd built something and didn't know if it was hope or waste. The last entry was dated October 3rd, 1957. No point maintaining further. The threat feels smaller now, or we've all just gotten tired of being afraid. 5 years. Someone had maintained this shelter for 5 years during the height of the Cold War, stocking it, checking it, believing that the world might end and that concrete and canned food might matter. Then they'd stopped. Maybe they'd died. Maybe they just decided to live above ground anyway, that the uncertainty of waiting was worse than the risk of not waiting. Annie sat on her heels in that bunker and felt something crack open inside her chest. This wasn't luck. It was a time capsule. It was a message from someone who'd stood where she stood now, terrified, preparing, storing everything they could in case the world abandoned them. The supplies were still good, the containers dry, the concrete had held. And now, 70 years later, they belonged to a woman with $87, sitting in a hole she dug with her own hands, discovering that someone else had already built her a survival. She didn't cry. She just sat there in the dark, with the flashlight pointed at those canned goods, and understood that she wasn't the first person to disappear underground when the world above became impossible. What she did next wasn't digging anymore. It was building. Now she understood something crucial. She understood something crucial. She didn't need to bury herself completely. The shelter could be her foundation. The real home would sit above it. She started framing out a structure against the hillside, using the bunker's concrete roof as a base. 2x4s from the construction site. She made 3 trips, loading her car until the suspension groaned. Some were water damaged, the wood soft and dark, but most had years left in them. She wasn't building fine, she was building functional. The upper chamber took shape over 2 weeks. She created a living space maybe 14 feet long, 10 feet wide. The walls angled to follow the hillside slope. One side backed directly against earth. The other side she left open. That would be where light came in, where air could move. The bunker below provided something crucial: thermal mass. Heat doesn't just disappear. It moves and settles. The concrete held temperature. The earth held it longer. She insulated the walls with what people threw away. Cardboard boxes flattened and layered. She collected them from behind grocery stores, storefronts, anywhere shipping happened. She packed the spaces between studs with leaves and dried grass, the kind of stuff that filled barns. An old dumpster behind a hotel yielded foam panels, water-stained but still useful. She layered it all, understanding without knowing the science that air pockets meant resistance. Resistance meant temperature stayed where you wanted it. For the roof, she found corrugated metal panels at a salvage yard, 50 cents each for pieces other people had torn down. She bought 5, nailed them down with scraps of wood, sealing the gaps with old tarps and roofing cement she'd traded for, with help splitting wood for a neighbor's stove. The ventilation system nearly defeated her. Stale air kills you as surely as coal does. She solved it with PVC pipe from a construction dump site, creating a simple gravity-fed system. Fresh air in through one pipe buried shallow in the earth above, stale air out through another. She hand-cranked a small fan she'd found at an estate sale for $3. It didn't draw much, barely moved the air, but it worked. The air inside stayed breathable, stayed dry. The wood stove was the final piece. She found it 30 miles away, an old cast-iron model someone had pulled from a barn renovation. The farmer wanted it gone. She hauled it in her Honda, the suspension bottoming out on the drive home. Getting it into the dugout took her and a man she'd met at the coffee shop, a carpenter named Thomas who'd started talking to her when she asked about metal venting. He didn't ask many questions, just helped. She paid him in split wood and coffee she made on a propane burner. The smell was ancient. Rust and old, the smell was ancient. Rust and old creosote burning clean. The heat poured out like the stove was alive, pressing against her skin, filling the small space with warmth that didn't fight the cold, but absorbed it, held it, made the earth around her feel like something breathing. By November, the thermometer on the inside wall read 70 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 28. She stood in that warmth with her breath no longer visible, understanding that she'd stopped surviving and started living. The shelter from the 1950s had given her what she needed, but the home she'd built from garbage and found materials had given her something else. Proof that the world doesn't have to choose what you become. The ice came on a Tuesday in January. Not snow, something worse. Freezing rain that coated everything in a glaze so thick the power lines couldn't hold it. Annie watched from the mouth of her dugout as the world turned to glass, branches bending under weight they weren't designed to carry. The first transformer blew at 3 a.m. She heard it from underground, a sound like the sky cracking, bright and sharp. The power grid in the county fed from 3 main lines. All 3 crossed the forest where she sat. All 3 came down in the next 2 hours. By morning, the town was dark. She listened to the hand-crank radio, the same one from the bunker downstairs, its speaker tinny and small. News reports cycled every hour. Power lines down across 6 counties. Estimated repair time, 2 to 3 weeks. The utility company issued a statement about how sorry they were. Infrastructure damage exceeding operational capacity. Crews would work around the clock. What that meant for the people in town was hours without heat. By evening, the news carried stories of families crowding into shelters set up in schools, hospitals running on generators, capacity overwhelmed. An elderly man found dead in his home the next morning. He turned off the furnace to save money, not understanding the cold had already begun. Annie sat at her small table, a cup of tea steaming in her hands, and felt the weight of the world's injustice settle on her shoulders like something physical. Her thermometer read 72 degrees. Outside, it was 14. The wood stove burned steadily, the heat it produced moving through the space with simple physics. Hot air rises. It warmed the upper chamber, radiated through the concrete below. The earth held the temperature, released it slowly. The system worked because it had to, because there was no grid to fail. No company promising reliability, then abandoning you when profit margins tightened. She had water from the hand pump connected to the spring she'd found. its source high enough to flow downhill without electricity. She had food from the bunker, canned goods from 1952 that had survived better than most modern marriages. She had warmth. She had shelter. She had everything the town had promised its residents and failed to deliver. The guilt came quickly, and that was harder than the cold. She wasn't gloating. She was grieving the version of her life that should have existed. The one where she didn't have to dig a hole to survive. The one where her company didn't restructure her away. The one where her ex-husband didn't decide that 22 years meant nothing when he wanted someone younger. The one where the systems built to protect people actually did. Instead, she'd become invisible. A woman so thoroughly erased from her previous life that she'd had to bury herself to exist at all. On day 4 of the outage, she heard sirens cutting through the forest. 3 ambulances headed toward town. She didn't know who they were carrying or why, just that somewhere in that cold, someone was breaking. She fed the stove more wood, felt the warmth deepen, and understood that survival wasn't a victory, it was just survival. The people in town would suffer for 3 weeks, and then the power would return, and they'd forget how fragile everything was, how easily the things they trusted could collapse. But Annie wouldn't forget. She was living inside the proof. The reporter showed up on day 9 of the outage. Her name was Patricia, and she worked for the regional paper that most people threw away without reading. She'd been investigating survival stories, the unofficial shelters, the generators that worked when they shouldn't have, the families who'd prepared. Someone in town had mentioned the woman in the forest with heat. Patricia had driven the edge of state land asking questions until a man at a gas station told her which embankment to look for. Annie heard the car before she saw it. The sound of tires on gravel, the careful approach of someone unfamiliar with the forest. She was standing outside, feeding the wood stove from her stockpile, when Patricia appeared through the trees. She was younger than Annie expected, maybe 35. She carried a notebook and looked cold. Annie almost closed the door. She'd spent 45 years avoiding attention, and the last months had taught her that invisibility was safer than being seen. But something in Patricia's face, a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with malice, made her step aside. They sat inside the dugout, and Patricia's eyes widened at the thermometer. 71 degrees. The woman had questions, and Annie, tired from weeks of silence, found herself answering them. How she'd built it, what she'd found underground, why. The last one took the longest to answer. Patricia left after 2 hours. She asked permission to come back. Annie said yes without meaning to. The article ran 4 days later. Front page of the regional section, then shared online, then picked up by outlets looking for hope in the darkness. Woman builds underground home for $100. Stays warm while town freezes. The photo showed Annie standing at the mouth of her dugout, her face half in shadow, the thermometer visible. She didn't recognize herself in the image. What happened next moved quickly. The story started with the shelter, but it didn't stay there. A journalist dug into records and found that the company restructuring Annie had been part of was the same one that managed the regional power grid. Not directly, the lines had been privatized, sold off, its maintenance outsourced to a contractor underfunded and understaffed. The company Annie used to work for had divested its power division in 2019, right before announcing that record profits would be distributed to shareholders. That same year, the power company eliminated its vegetation management division. Trees that should have been trimmed grew into lines. Lines that should have been buried remained above ground. The narrative became impossible to ignore. A woman with nothing had built a home that protected her. A company that had discarded her had failed to protect thousands. The math was simple. The meaning was crushing. Officials arrived next. Surveyors and historians from the state, curious about the fallout shelter. They catalogued it, called it a significant Cold War artifact. Started asking questions about how many others existed, unmarked and forgotten, scattered across the landscape like seeds the government had planted and then abandoned. No one had answers. No one had been keeping track. The attention grew. A contractor offered her a job. A non-profit offered a grant. Journalists called asking if she'd do interviews, a podcast, a book. The human interest angle was too good to waste. Woman survives through ingenuity and grit. The American story repackaged. But Annie understood what the articles weren't saying, what they couldn't quite articulate. The real victory wasn't that she'd survived. The real victory was that her survival exposed everything broken about the systems everyone had agreed to trust. She'd built something that worked. The company had built something that failed. The difference between them wasn't luck or intelligence, it was necessity. When you have no grid to fall back on, you build something that doesn't need one. The power returned on day 21. The lines came back to life, the transformers hummed, and the town heated again. Within a week, the story had moved to the next tragedy, the next crisis. The world keeps moving. But Annie's thermometer still read 71 degrees, and the question that remained, unanswered and burning, was simpler than anyone wanted to ask. If a woman with nothing could build this, why couldn't the company with everything? But what nobody asked, and what Annie didn't volunteer, was the cost of what she'd built. The loneliness of those first weeks had been total, the kind where you stop speaking out loud because there's no one to hear you, and eventually your voice becomes strange to your own ears. She'd sat in that hole in the ground, wrapped in cardboard, listening to her own breathing echo off the walls. That's when the fear had come, not the clean fear of a specific danger, but the formless dread of a person who'd understood that no one knew where she was. If something went wrong, if she couldn't dig her way out, if the shelter collapsed, if the cold reached too deep, no one would find her until the smell made them curious. She hadn't survived because she was stronger than anyone else or smarter than the systems that had discarded her. She'd survived because she'd had no other option, because the earth itself had held her when nothing else would. The distinction mattered. Strength implies choice. She'd had none. But down in the bunker, in the dark, she'd found something that changed the shape of her loneliness. The logbook. The careful handwriting of a person who'd built something they didn't know if anyone would ever use. 5 years of maintenance. 5 years of believing that the worst could come, and that preparation mattered, even if no one ever thanked you for it. That person was dead now, 70 years dead, and Annie carried canned goods from their survival into her own. The connection wasn't mystical, it was just human. A stubborn refusal to accept that nothing could be done. A person standing at the edge of everything and building anyway, with no certainty of return. Annie understood it now. That was the real inheritance, not supplies, not shelter, but the knowledge that someone else had stood in the dark and worked. The dugout cabin was warm, 70 degrees on a January night when the town was cold and dark. She'd built it with her hands and with materials the world had thrown away. Every board salvaged from a structure someone else had abandoned, every nail from a pile of scraps. The stove that heated her pulled from a barn destined for a landfill. The concrete beneath her feet, poured by a government that had feared the sky burning, now supporting a woman with nothing. But it was also a tomb. A hole where a person had to disappear to survive. The cost of safety was invisibility. The cost of heat was isolation. She had warmth now, and clean water, and food, She had a home that didn't require a paycheck or a marriage or the world's permission to exist. She also had a grave she dug herself and then learned to live in. The gratitude was real, and the anger was real too, both at the same time. She was grateful to be alive. She was furious that being alive had required disappearing. The town's power came back after 3 weeks. The grid hummed back to life. People turned their thermostats up to 72, 75, 80, complaining about the electric bill. The news cycle moved on. The company issued a statement about improving infrastructure, new funding, renewed commitment to safety. Annie's thermometer never dropped below 68 degrees. The earth held the temperature. The shelter held it. Her small wood stove held it. The system she'd built asked nothing of anyone and failed no one. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired. The question that stayed with her was harder than any she'd faced. Not, did I survive? But, what did I survive into? 3 weeks after the power came back, Annie received a letter from lawyers. The company, her old company, the one that had restructured her, wanted to talk. They wanted to settle. The terms were simple. Money in exchange for silence. Not a huge amount. $50,000. Enough to move into an actual house. Enough to pretend the last year hadn't happened. Enough to shut up. She read the letter 3 times, felt the weight of it in her hand. $50,000 would have changed everything 6 months ago. Would have meant she didn't have to sleep in a hole, didn't have to wrap herself in cardboard, didn't have to understand survival at the level of her bones. She declined it, called the lawyers back and said no. They asked if she wanted to counter. She said she didn't want anything. They didn't believe her. Lawyers don't understand people who refuse to be bought. But she refused anyway. Not from righteousness, not from some principle about standing up to corporations. She refused because she understood something the company didn't. The settlement was meant to erase her. If she took the money and signed the non-disclosure, she'd disappear again. The story would be contained. The narrative would shift to victim gets justice, and the real conversation about systems failure would die. She didn't need vindication. She needed the conversation to stay open. Space she'd built, kept the wood stove space she'd built, kept the wood stove burning, kept the thermometer visible. The shelter from the 1950s stayed sealed below, catalogued by the State Historical Society, becoming a record of Cold War paranoia. But the home she'd built from nothing, that stayed alive. That stayed hers. People started coming to the forest. Not many, not constantly, but enough. Students studying earth-sheltered housing, architects curious about passive thermal systems, people who'd seen the story and wanted to understand how someone with nothing had built something. Annie began talking about it, not as triumph, but as necessity. Here's what happens when you have no other choice. Here's what the earth can teach you if you're desperate enough to listen. She didn't frame it as inspiration. She framed it as information. This is how you insulate without money. Logbook from the bunker stayed where she found it. She read it sometimes, the careful handwriting of a person maintaining a shelter during the Cold War. 5 years. Believing something, then stopping, then never knowing if the belief had mattered. Annie didn't know if her story would matter either, if the company would change, if the power grid would actually be funded properly, or if the next ice storm would knock it down again, if people would remember any of this once the news cycle moved forward. She just knew that she'd built something that worked, and that the person who'd built the shelter below her had done the same, and that 70 years separated them, but the knowledge remained. When the world abandons you, You don't stop existing. You just exist differently, deeper, in the places the systems can't reach. Annie stands at the entrance to her dugout on a clear winter morning, the thermometer visible. 71 degrees inside, 20 degrees outside. The equation is simple. The meaning is not. She didn't defeat the system. She just stopped waiting for it to save her. If you want to understand what happens when people stop asking for rescue and start building, subscribe. Because the real stories aren't written in the light, they're carved into the earth.